Good evening. I'd like to call the Planning Commission meeting for Tuesday, June 4th, 2024 to order. First, we'll have our land acknowledgement. Would someone like to read the land acknowledgement?
We acknowledge that the city of Kenmore is situated upon the ancestral lands of the Snohomish, Snoqualmie, Soxhawtla, Duwamish, Stillaguamish, Tulalip, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, and other tribes who are part of the Coast Salish peoples. We recognize and express our deepest respect for their enduring stewardship and profound relationship with this land, which they have cherished and protected since time immemorial. We honor the First Peoples, acknowledge their vibrant cultures, and commit ourselves to learning from their wisdom in our journey to promote justice, equity, and mutual understanding. We pledge to stand alongside these communities in acknowledging past injustices and working towards a future that respects and celebrates the diverse heritage of this land.
Please rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, and justice. Oops, that was me. That was me. Oh, okay. That's a good thing we had our mics on, right? There you go. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. Oh, Madam Clerk, do we have anyone present or in the cloud to speak to us tonight?
There are no public comments in person or virtually.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to the next item. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
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 All those opposed? It is adopted by unanimous consent. So we're just cruising along, flag salute or not. So I would like to ask our esteemed staff of Todd. I don't know if Debbie wants to say hi or not, but Todd is going to take us from here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, good evening, commissioners. Tonight, we're pleased to have Clay White from Kimley Horn here tonight to kick us off in our middle housing discussion. I know some of you were able to join us at the open house that we had a couple weeks ago, and thanks for joining. And so I'm going to hand the mic over to Clay this evening, and he'll take the lead on giving a presentation and then kind of just open it up for discussion to kind of get things started and where we head from here on middle housing. So take it away, Clay.
Great. Hopefully everybody can hear me all right. For the record, my name is Clay White with Kimley Horn. Happy to be here tonight to help kind of guide through our discussions on middle housing. Have just a few kind of goals for our presentation tonight. Well, I think we need to present here. Oh, sorry. I was trying to get. Oh, perfect. So we're gonna just provide a quick project overview. I know that we did this when we had the joint session with the city council, so we won't go too far with that, but do a little recap of the city council planning commission study session and what we heard. Recap of the community open house. Love if for planning commissioners that were in attendance, if you want to share what you heard, it would be great to be able to hear that. And then discuss a little bit about the policy approach as we start developing policies as part of the housing element or other elements. And then talk a little bit about next step and answer questions from the planning commission. I think if we could kind of think, if we're kind of framing up what a really good meeting tonight would be, we understand a little bit about what state laws are telling us that we have to focus on, and we're hearing from the community about the things that are important. Perfect. So anything that can help start narrowing like the policy areas we should focus on. You know, how do we make this Kenmore specific? And we don't, you know, we have some guidance from the state of things we have to cover, but what do you think are the things that are important to the community that we can put into policies? Or how do we start thinking about preparing regulations that would, you know, permit more middle housing, but maybe it's doing it in a way that could also hit the goals that you're establishing. So if we start just having that framework, then we can start to put together a draft that reflects that. And then we can massage a little further and go a little further as we go to the, you know, get through public hearings. But I have a few thoughts for you that I put into the briefing, a document to maybe tee up some kind of concepts that you might want to touch on. But anything you're interested in, then we can bring that back and then that can be part of that discussion. And then you can narrow it as you make a recommendation to the city council later this year. So on my end, that would be really helpful because it'll really help us as we do our work. All right, so just a little bit about House Bill 1110. We've talked about this before. Passed the legislature in 2023. Part of a broad set of housing reforms from the legislature. As you're going through your comprehensive plan update, I'm sure you've talked about like these changes with the housing element requirements, a little more granular planning, not just planning for the capacity of planning for enough people, but it's also getting down to the housing types that match people's incomes. So you're talking more about the specific housing types that are needed for different groups of people. We also have House Bill 1337 that's focused on more accessory dwelling units, a whole host of legislation, but there's been a big emphasis on housing in Olympia over the last 4 or 5 years. It requires the city to adopt housing policies and implementing regulations focused on providing more middle housing options in your residential zones, specifically the R1, R4, and R6 zones. This is different than some legislation. So in some bills, if you didn't adopt any changes, you might be out of compliance, or if there was a hearings board appeal, they might say, hey, you got to go back and do something. This legislation is a little different. If you don't take action, it will go into effect. So there's certain provisions of the statute that will go into effect. So which may not be a good thing because you may not be able to frame the code in a way that would kind of suit what you're looking for. And then the requirements are kind of modified by population. We've talked a little bit about that. There's different requirements for cities under 25,000, those between 25 and 75,000, and those over 75,000. You're right at 24,000 plus a whole bunch of people, and you're going to cross that threshold. So there's been this conversation of, you know, you could do regulations that kind of fit that lower threshold, but then you'd have to come up and update them in a few years. I think what we heard from at the joint meeting was maybe proceed with the over 25,000 process, just because it will make us, you know, we can look at everything kind of holistically, but certainly that's something that's still up for discussion. Yes.
A quick question.
Yes.
So is anybody going to look over our adopted ordinance and say whether it's in compliance or not, other than if we get sued?
No, it's just like any other legislative action you take. It's appealable to the Growth Management Hearings Board within 60 days. But it's not something that has to go to Commerce for approval. There are those 3 options for adopt. We went through them at the meeting. There is this alternative compliance option where you come up with your own kind of approach to meeting the requirements, which I don't think we're going down that path. That one has to go to Commerce for review before you adopt it. But otherwise, it's just an ordinance, just like any other ordinance.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep. So in addition to applying to the R1, R4, and R6 zones, on the map we have, you can see kind of a dotted outline. Those are our areas that from high capacity transit. We'll talk a little bit about what that means in terms of the number of units per lot that must be allowed. One of the things to keep in mind is you can't apply development regulations and standards that are stricter than those that will be applied to single family dwelling units. There's been legislation that limits the amount of design review you can have, 1 public meeting for design review if you were going to apply design review to these processes. It limits parking requirements, and we will be developing new regulations to allow unit lot subdivisions or Commonwealth subdivisions. I think what you'll find there, it's a little trickier on the application side because it impacts, you know, having individual water sewer meters and electric meters because you own your own lot, just like you might own your single family home. But in terms of looks, it really will look the same. It's just really focused on the form of ownership, condominium ownership versus owning fee simple. So it's really the statutes that are applied. So just a little bit of reminder on the bill requirements. In 2023, the population was 24,230. That's gone up a little bit. The tier 2 requirements, which I think we're going down the path of focusing on, would require allowing at least 6 of the 9 middle housing types. Just to kind of, you know, the current code allows townhomes. And so that could be buildings that have 3, 4, 5, 6 units in a structure. So, I mean, you're already with the code allowing a lot of the housing types that are required to be allowed under this. It's just sometimes you're not going to see them built because you still have to meet all the regulations to build them, like density requirements or height standards or setbacks. So again, we are not writing policy and code to set it up. So something you say you can do, you can't actually build. But there are times that something may be allowed, but it may not be permitted. So you're a lot of the way already there with the current code. Tier 2 is 2 units per lot. So it's a little bit different than thinking about a lot of density requirements. You'll see how many dwelling units per acre. This kind of gets more granular and says, so if you have a single family home, you could have an additional lot on there. And then that could be subdivided. So it could be owned individually, fee simple. And then the allowance for 4 units per lot when you're a certain distance to a major transit stop, or when 1 unit is affordable. And there is a definition in the statute about the affordability and how long it has to be affordable. At least I've heard from the colleagues that I work with that may not be used a lot in terms of the way it's set up right now. It would be pretty difficult to make a pencil depending on the community, but every community is a little different. And then if you go back to like the map that we showed, the 4 units, the distance that you have to allow the 4 units when one is near transit is that dotted line. There's not very much area there. That most of those areas are already higher density housing. I mean, these are the areas that are closer to your downtown. And so I wouldn't suspect that's going to be used quite a bit. I think most of the time you're going to see an additional lot being built, 2 units. And I'm not sure if it'll pencil too much to remove 1 home and build 2 homes. I mean, that would be very costly. So you may see an additional home being built on the back of a lot where you have larger lots, and you do have some of those in the city. Yes.
I think I may have misunderstood or re-misunderstood along the way. Can you clarify, is a fourplex 1 unit or 4 units?
That would be 4 units.
Okay, all right. So cottage housing, if they were single units, individual boxes, 1 unit each, or a mother-in-law is 1 unit. But when you're talking number of addresses within a dwelling, they're each their own unit.
Yes, I mean, I think if you're looking at like one single family lot has a home, if you could have 1 more unit, if it was a smaller unit, it's probably less cottage and more like an ADU.
Right.
You know, you're only going to see cottage development if you would aggregate a whole bunch of property together.
Right.
You know, so I think it's probably less likely you would see a ton of it, except for where you have maybe some really large lots and then you could aggregate. We'll talk a little bit about some questions we asked at the open house, but I mean, I think some of the other challenges with cottage housing is you have to provide, I think, some incentive to build cottage housing over larger homes. I mean, if you can build 10 cottage units or 10 single family homes with the colossal land, you're going to build 10 homes. So what is the incentive to do it? Is it bonus densities? Is it reduced parking, or both? But I think you have to find a way, or, you know, if you don't reduce parking, you end up with 10 homes and you've got 24 parking spaces behind those units. You know, that's not what they typically show you in the picture. So, you know, maybe you're looking for things where it's closer to transit, where you're already reducing parking. But it's harder to build in a more built environment. Yes, Commissioner.
Question, we're looking at 2 units per lot. I keep struggling with what is the definition of a lot. So is the 2 unit density Is that irrespective of the size of the lot? Is there still a minimum lot size? How does that play into it?
Yeah, you're not able to regulate under 1,000 square feet, but there isn't like this multiplier effect. So I think that it really depends on how we construct the code. I think what you could do is you could still have density apply, like this zone, generally you can have this many units, and then each one of those lots could have an additional unit or have 2 ADUs or however you construct it. But then it doesn't mean once you construct those that each one of those can then go and go and go. So I think we have to make sure it's really easy for the reader to know how you maneuver between density and then lot density. I mean, it's a different concept. So either, I think probably the easiest way is to kind of leave the way the code is constructed now, but use some footnotes to get you to a different section of code that says when you meet these additional standards, you can have an additional unit per lot. But so does that answer your question?
Well, I think you're getting there, but I think this is someplace where we're going to need to have some more discussion and it's probably some technical assistance, because it's clear that when you look across the city, there is a variation in the size of a lot. And depending upon how large that lot is, you could get into some really dense development if you take literally 2 or 3 or 4 units per lot. So I think what I think you were alluding to, at some point we need to come back, and we don't have a minimum lot density or lot size. There has to be some way to be able to control that so we don't have an unacceptable level of density.
Yeah, and I think we get there by saying that currently that would be controlled because you have a certain amount of, you have a number of units per acre. So you can have 7 dwelling units per acre. If they come in, can we subdivide our lot? Yes, you can have 2 more you can have 2 lots under our code, or 4 or 5. Then each one of those could, utilize these requirements. So I think it'll be okay. You're gonna see smaller lots, but there isn't this where it can keep aggregating. So I think we want to make sure we get the base density where you want it and kind of understand how that works with the current scheme.
Thank you. Yeah, I kind of have a follow-up question to that. So right now, typically the higher density for residential, like the higher density of the low densities, to be clear, is R6, right? So 6 units an acre. I guess to me, when I interpreted this, I would see that as effectively becoming 12 units an acre if you, double.
Under the 2
housing.
dwelling units per lot,
Yeah,
yes.
exactly.
Yep.
And I guess my question is personally, I don't want to do this, but what's stopping something from saying, oh, we're going to make it 3 units an acre, so that way we don't actually increase density in any meaningful way.
Well,
R6 areas, sorry.
No, I think that's a good question. I think that your development regulations are going to help guide what people can and can't do. You've got setbacks, height requirements, and pervious standards. So I think you can utilize those to kind of understand where the limits. So sometimes it's not just like how many dwelling units per acre can you have, or how many units you can have per lot, but you got to think about how does that work in context with all of these other requirements. And then in the end, it might spit out, okay, you may be able to do this under code, but you couldn't get to this specific thing because you have to have a 20-foot setback from your property line. So we were, talking about doing some like lot mock-ups or something like that, where we kind of walk through like under the current code, if you apply your current standards, if you wanted to do X on this lot, and we can take a real lot, but not kind of describe where it is and go, see, it wouldn't work because you wouldn't meet the setbacks and things like that, or you may increase the pervious standard. So you can kind of see, you may want to adjust your regulations as it applies to these developments because that push and pull of like how things work. So, but I think you can avoid kind of oversaturation or something just by, some of the regulations that might apply.
Yeah, I suppose, sorry, just to respond, I suppose my concern is more along the lines of, to me, a piece of this is to help produce infill development, which requires, frankly, additional units, additional density, and oftentimes, floor area that's being sold, just to pencil from a financial standpoint. And while I think that will happen if we allow it to. My concern, I guess, is a push trying to keep things the way they are, keep density the way it is today. And as such, effectively kill any benefit this provides beyond allowing a new property owner to demo an existing building and rebuild in a way that is more flexible and no other benefit from this, right? Which would effectively make it difficult to actually see any meaningful change for people purchasing houses beyond people who have the ability to afford that cost to go in and do it for themselves.
That makes sense. I mean, I don't think we're going here with this project. I'll defer to the people on my left. But I mean, if you wanted to have more housing in some of these zones, you would just, I think you would increase the base density that currently exists. Because it's not an easy process to go through. Like, I'm going to subdivide this and then I'm going to come through and do an entirely new process to go and do it again. I mean, so if you're at 6 dwelling units per acre, if you wanted to be at 10, then I mean, I think you accomplish that goal just through a standard process that could be available in the code. Is that more of what you're getting at?
Yeah, exactly. And it just seems like something where I see why the flexibility is put in there, but I could also see it kind of defeating the purpose to some degree, right? Like, you build a bunch of townhomes and things that look great and look like they should be walkable, but then stuff is still spread out and it's not actually walkable, right?
Yeah.
Stuff like that. So yeah, thank you.
I mean, that is if you're trying to get to that, you know, in certain areas having higher densities in residential zones, I mean, that's the easier way to get to it, is just, you know, have it in your base zoning rather than some special standards that you got to go through multiple processes. Open up the housing types, especially attached. I mean, that's how you get there. You know, this will work, but in certain circumstances. So it starts that journey, but yeah.
You did bring up that you thought it would be a good idea to have examples out, and I very much believe that that's going to be necessary, and that there would need to be not just a couple, but several machinations of how this could work, so that our citizens can see, if you start with this, how it could go to that, and then, or how it can't go here. But if you start with this, you know, because this is so complicated
It is.
that most of our residents really have no concept of what this is going to do, and if it really applies to them.
Yeah.
So somehow, when we get to our next public event, hopefully before a public hearing, we want to have very calm public hearings, this is this kind of document would be well saturated in the community. So at least when they were to come and make comments, they would be rational comments directly related to example 3 or example 4 or whatever, and then we can address those issues. So I'm with you on that, because that would be very, very helpful in what you can and can't do. I'm still, okay, my last question. You did use the 3-letter word ADU. And I thought this whole missing middle housing had nothing to do with ADUs, or am I a little mistaken, or is it how you frame an ADU?
Yeah, I think it's just more like there's so many pieces of legislation that have passed. House Bill 1337, a different piece of legislation, requires provisions for accessory dwelling units. So we're going to try to make sure there's something that can meet your obligations under both statutes if we're doing this. You're not required to, again, this like doubling effect, you're not required to allow 2 units per lot and then 2 ADUs on each one of those lots. So there's some guidance that's been provided on kind of how the legislation, these bills were adopted, and the timing and how they kind of work together, because they are a bit confusing when you read them together about like what's allowed. But we're gonna at least try to address these together. There's no reason to kind of take them as separate community conversations.
Okay.
Sometimes, I mean, personally, as a planner, I've done this for a long time, I get confused about like, what's the difference between an ADU and a single family home other than like size? You know, I mean, so, I mean, I think it's, so unless you're limiting the size, I mean, is that just a small home or when do you cross over? So I think, but we're gonna try to address both as we go through this process.
Thank you. That's very comforting. That was one of my concerns as well as when you start looking at this, the crossover between ADUs and missing middle, this can become very complicated, which I think I hear a evolving theme here, which is simplicity. We need to be able to communicate this to folks out there, but we also need to have a set of rules that can be truly implemented in a way that people can understand. And we have a challenge, I think, given the geography in our city. We've got hillsides, we've got slopes, we've got flat areas, we've got a mix of different lot sizes. We've got part of the city where it's very small lot sizes, others with very large shop sizes. So we're going to need to have some kind of an approach that takes that into account. Kind of suggested a way we could take a look at those R designations, and that may be a simple way to be able to do this. But I think we're going to need to have a more simplistic approach that kind of demystifies the 2 unit per lot or 4 unit per lot, and really pass not only concrete examples, but really think through how those could truly be implemented when you've got somebody trying to sit down and evaluate a proposal.
Yes, and I think that's why we're trying to maybe think about this a little differently and how do you tease out, I mean, we were talking about if you're trying to encourage development, but you've got concerns over impervious surface maximums or heights or setbacks. You kind of go, we asked a few questions at the open house, but it wasn't to get information really on that specific question. It was getting people thinking about these trade-offs. You know, if you want this, then you've got to incentivize this. Do you want to incentivize people to try to do certain things? You know, maybe it's more development than what you had contemplated, but if it looks like this, then I'm all for it. You know, so at least trying to think about like, how do you design your code to focus on the type of development that you're wanting to see? They're trying to, and I think like the visuals of the lots helps people think like spatially with a lot, like you only have so much room. So a driveway has to fit and get into the back. Well, if there's only 20 feet between the house and the side property line, but seeing that you go, okay, I see why you have to have a driveway at that location, or how do you get people back there and that kind of stuff. So we'll try to provide that context so people can kind of see that, and then they can tell you, you know, I do like this, or I don't like this, or how do you kind of work through some of those tough issues?
So are there existing examples of middle housing in Kenmore? And if so, what's working, what's not working? Do we have any idea as to what works and what doesn't work in this area?
The types of middle housing that are working in Kenmore or in other
That exist in Kenmore, that are around in Kenmore. Do we have any information on that, whether or not some may work, some may not work? That might be a question for Debbie. That
We have some middle housing.
Yeah.
It's just the form of the housing, and there's places that allowed for that previously or had variances or were zoned for it. And so they were constructed in a style similar to what this is getting at. Sorry, Debbie, I'll let you answer.
No, you're on the right track. If you're asking me how many are there and where they are, I don't have an exact count. I would say that's sort of an indicative of there aren't that many out there. Because typically this style of housing is you find in older neighborhoods before kind of zoning came in and restricted those kinds of housing. So when Kenmore developed, there were either restrictions in covenants that restricted additional kinds of units, or when zoning went in place, it basically said in single family neighborhoods, you basically restricted to a single family home with limited options for doing anything else. So the idea of these regulations is basically to go back to a time when there was more choice in terms of the type of housing that could be built. And there are some, just as a local example, in Bothell, just around the City Hall neighborhood there, that's an older neighborhood, and you can walk around that neighborhood and you can see some great examples of duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes, some which have been there a long time and some which are now starting to come in.
There's a, if you go to Bothell's page, I'm just stealing their thunder a little bit, but they recently had some open house material within the last 6 months or so. And if you take a look, they actually have a map, and you can, as Debbie said, walk around the kind of old town part of Bothell, and you'll find several examples. So that'll give you kind of an idea of what is possible in Kenmore. Yeah.
On that note about what's possible, something else I was noticing was that 1/4 mile limit. And one of the things I was wondering is well, not wondering, I guess to me, a 1/4 mile is based off the research that says that's about the maximum distance a person will walk, right? That said, the study that I've seen with that is it's a 1/2 mile, but it starts to taper off pretty dramatically after a 1/4 mile, right? And over time, as walk sheds improve and we have more options for places for people to go, or at least the ability to create those things, I feel like a 1/4 mile is pretty conservative, especially given that we already have kind of this denser development closer to the downtown core. So I was wondering what either increasing that to a 1/2 mile, I don't really love that option, but maybe not even increasing that, but keeping it at a 1/4 mile, but looking at other routes that might not be high capacity transit, but they have protected, walkways and bikeways. They're within some distance of amenities like a grocery store that wouldn't require a car, that type of standard, to expand that a little bit, or at least make it so it's actually something that could be used. Because right now it seems to me like it would apply to very few parcels. So, yeah.
I mean, I kind of defer to Debbie and Todd. Do you see that if you want to do that better accomplished, maybe through just the underlying zoning densities rather than applying the middle housing densities? And I mean, because it's the, those base densities, because you have a lot of middle housing zone, you can get higher densities within that 1/4 mile. I think if you wanted to increase that area, you'd have to take a look and say, is applying these regulations the way to do that? Or is it increasing, having the zoning allow more than 6 dwelling units per acre in those R6 zones or something?
I know at the open house that we just had, there were a couple of attendees that were mentioning, why is it just 522 as the only corridor? What if we considered, say, 61st to a certain, radius of 522? We're not considering, like, say, the whole entire length up to the county line, but say a certain distance, or maybe 73rd, or the kind of those corridors where it's in close proximity to 522, but it just might go a little bit further. Or I know at one point, Debbie, correct me if I'm wrong, but if it, like, Juanita Drive may have been considered as a transit corridor, but then it was kind of taken off the table as not a major corridor.
Well, I'm sure some of the planning commission members will remember round one middle housing, when we were looking at where to do this, and it was looking at the Juanita Drive 153rd transit route within a 1/4 mile of that. I think then the definition changed in the state law, which then took off that other bus route. So that's why it would not be included if we were just looking at state law. Could we go further than state law? Yes, we can. What we might want to do, though, is consider that as sort of a phase 2, and then consider this is what we're going to do in this phase for complying with state law, and then consider things for phase 2, whether that is alternative transit routes, whether it's proximity to grocery stores, whether it's looking at maybe allowing neighborhood retail in different areas to support that. So I would say, yes, you can always do more. I think it's complicated. Frankly, I think it's complicated enough to try and get this done without then trying to explain to people we're going to do this and more. But I don't think there's any reason why we couldn't suggest that let's do this, and then maybe as a next phase consider looking at other ways to implement this as well.
Understood. And part of the reason I think I was looking at that is I really like having that transition from higher densities to lower densities, having a diversity of building types and heights and uses. I find it tends to make more interesting places like the plaza over here. I think it's a good example. South Lake Union has some parts of it that are good examples. Wedgewood, Bothell, they've got some good examples. So that's kind of what I was getting at. I agree though, Debbie, that it is difficult to explain both those changes. I think it's something more I want to make sure we're thinking about, because one concern I've heard repeatedly is we don't have the infrastructure. And while I understand that concern, I don't see how we get the infrastructure if there's never going to be the people to use it, because we don't, or at least use it to a degree where it justifies the infrastructure if we don't allow for that to be an option or a path in the future. So, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense because I know that people have brought up about getting some of the corner retail and stuff, but you need the density around it to be able to support it. And so, I mean, I do like the idea of getting through this, this first project. How's it working? What needs to be changed? And then maybe you can kind of go like, oh, take that next step. So at least we'll head in that direction, but obviously that could change.
Go ahead.
Yeah, another thing I think is important for us to remember is just because there is public transit doesn't mean the public transit on that road operates 7 days a week or past 6 o'clock in the evening. For me, as an example, I don't have any public transit between here and where I live. I could walk almost 2 miles to the bus stop and then take the bus stop down here and then backtrack the same amount of space I would have just taken a right and ended up here at City Hall. But yeah, when we're talking like, why can't we add this road or parts of Juanita? Like parts of Juanita are only serviced by bus routes at very limited times of the week and day. So it's really not reasonable. I can't take a bus to pop up to St. Ed's for dinner. I still got to walk a mile down the driveway to get to dinner once I get off the bus. But yeah, and the other thing, of course, that would really extend the pedestrian capabilities would be golf carts, but I'm just.
Well, I was just going to suggest that. I was going to say, this is where golf carts come in play.
Yeah. Can I talk?
Go ahead and talk more about golf carts.
Great, that's what I was gonna do. I was gonna say, when you were mentioning transit, I didn't take transit, I walked here. Cause it's gonna, and I'm by the high capacity bus route, right? But to go to the bus stop, wait for the bus, it doesn't make sense. And mode split, in my experience, it's most granular with walking, and then it gets a bit bigger with biking, gets a lot bigger with transit. But the convenience of walking is you go out of your house and you go to the place next door. And the convenience with biking is you're going faster than you're walking, and you don't have to necessarily find parking. You can park up front. So to me, I would still want to allow for more of that, because I could walk, I could reasonably bike or take a golf cart to St. Ed's, right? And that's going to take a heck of a lot less space than if I took up my car. So, yeah.
So we're really digging into the weeds here now, which I think is good. This is all stuff we've got to circle back to at some point. Hey, it's the back nine. What I've got out of this last section here, which I think is something we might want to think about as we go along, how we organize our thoughts, is not thinking of missing middle as one shot and done. That this is an evolutionary process that follows what happens with your population, what happens with your growth downtown, your economic development. All of that has to reinforce. We could go out here and build redo half of our houses in missing middle. What would that look like? That's one thing, but would it really work? And most of the time where I've seen and where I've actually lived, where missing middle really works, it's in more dense, already dense urban areas. We're not that. We're probably going to be at some point. So I think having a process as we go through this that takes into account that we're starting from here, we're likely to get here somewhere else. Maybe that's 10, maybe that's 20 years down the line. But how do we have a development rules to allow that to happen, that evolution to grow over time? So we're not constraining ourselves to what we are today, but we're not setting up something that's so complex that we're going to end up with a mishmash, I use an old New York term there, for what our town looks like. I don't think we want to end up with the canyons of Kenmore, and I don't think we want to end up with 50 different types of, that's an over exaggeration, I'm sorry. We don't want to have such a mix of housing styles, housing heights, without the infrastructure in place that's needed to support that level of density. So we need to have some control here. So I'm looking for us, how do we develop the standards that allow that evolution to happen and keeps us on a path that ends up with a town that we're going to want to live in 20 years from now.
Well, luckily, we're planners, and this is why.
I know, was that a softball lobbed or not?
What? Yeah, this is exactly it. You know, you think about the future. We're not, you know, you do your best not to react to the things that are happening, but proactively think about your community and the things that you want to see, so you can get the codes that line up with that future, and hopefully, and it's not going to be perfect, and you're going to have to adjust, but like, so be thinking about that. Yeah, I mean, you're probably not going to see all this growth happen at once, but you're really visioning, like, how are we going to get prepared for these? How do you think about capital facilities and infrastructure and impacts to neighborhoods and providing more housing choices for people? I mean, all of those things. So yeah, I mean, hopefully that's what we start with this process.
Yes, I think that's what we're looking for the three people at this table for, is just come back and say, well, that's a great idea. In 20 years from now, that's probably a good idea, but you need to pull back for right now. Oh, and then this other side, tell us that you're just not thinking about this aggressively enough for right now. You could do more now, but we need you guys to help us with that, because
Commissioner Dorian.
First, I'd like to suggest a term of art. I'm thinking golf carts could be called middle transit. I think that might be useful. But connected to that, I think there's, for the community, there's interest in what we're not going to cover around this as well, because that's where we got wrapped around the axle in phase one as well. I think is that there's been some discussion already that, you know, around concurrency, is that, well, we've got to update all of our transportation plan immediately as well, which I think does not have to happen around this, because we're really, what we're thinking is that this is incremental. And when we come to do the transportation element again, then we'll look at if there's anything we need to change around housing projections, etc. And it's that kind of thing that I think people are getting tripped up on around this. And also the broader housing needs, like most of our housing needs for growth are going to be in the 50%, 30% range in terms of our quotas. And this is not going to give us that. So while it's really important that we enable it, it's not kind of our focus in terms of where we're trying to drive that growth. And there's that understanding as well. I think it struggles in the middle because it's getting hit from both sides. It's like, it doesn't do what people who want the really truly affordable housing want. And there's also the folks who have single family homes who are worried it's going to reduce their property values. And it's like, so we get hammered on both sides in terms of the messaging, I think.
Yes, and I mean, I think you both made a good point. I mean, one is this isn't a one-off project. This is a long-term thing. Two, you're right. I mean, middle housing is one small piece of a very much larger puzzle. So communities across the state are planning not just for middle housing, but they're planning for more housing, denser to hit a variety of income bands, people making different incomes. So, I mean, I think it's all happening all at once. In terms of capital facilities, I think that, you know, considering this is new type of development in a lot of communities, I think how to incorporate thinking about neighborhoods that might redevelop, and then how do you integrate improvements as part of your capital facility planning is something that communities are going to have to take on in the future. So if you're not going to maybe have all of the sidewalks and infrastructure when the second house goes up on a lot, but thinking about that's planning too. You know, how does the city make those investments in neighborhoods especially, or how do you make improvements and get development to pay back into those through latecomers agreements and other things, or grant programs you can get. So I think it's going to open up that door to kind of matching all of those things up. Maybe we'll keep going on slides.
Well, I have a couple things.
Well, let's keep going.
So 4 items. The first and most important is the environment. And I think that the more dense we get, the more likelihood that we're going to see a reduction of our tree canopy, as well as issues related to the streams and wetlands. I would bring up the point that the Master Builders Association, if I got that right, made the last city council meeting during their testimony on the tree ordinance, is that they feel that a tree ordinance gets in the way of building and that you just gotta let some go. Now, he didn't exactly say that, but that's my version, my personal version of what came across. I am not in favor of letting our environment go for the purposes of higher density. That's just not what Kenmore is. And I don't think that our residents and voters want to see that. So that's of particular concern to me. The next.
You want us to answer that one first?
Oh, say again, did you want to say something?
Yeah.
Oh, I know.
I know, because before we move on, because then I'm going to forget what you said on the first question. So in response to your concern about that, yes, we recognize that it's a balance. You have to deal with this balance every time you look at a policy. It's a balance of whether it's housing and the environment. You've done that many times in this job, and this is what we have to do as well. And given that the city has adopted new tree regulations, we then have to take a look at the impact of those tree regulations as we develop new housing regulations. It's a balance. I think we're trying to figure out the best way to have both, but there might have to be some compromise here to achieve goals, whether it's the environmental goals, which we all care about, and the housing goals, which we all care about. And both are important to have that livable community. We are aware of that tension and that conflict, and we know we'll have to spend some time with development services in terms of analyzing the existing tree regulations and how they will then have to play with the new regulations that we're bringing forward for middle housing.
And I very much appreciate your comments on that. And in many ways, I agree. Another way to add to that is to say that some of our constituents believe that the environmental regulations that we have now don't go far enough. So we're still going to have that, like you were saying, but it's going to be on two sides. It's not going to be pressure. It's going to be pressure both ways on new regulations. So the second question is that this whole ball of wax has nothing to do with mandatory implementation in a new code about neighborhood businesses. Is that correct?
Correct. I think that came up because more housing, and this came up in phase one of, it was one of the things that we analyzed as part of phase one is possible locations for future neighborhood business zones. So housing and business directly is connected, but it's not mandated as part of this project.
And we've talked about that on this panel for some time, and it's kind of been bounced around a lot. But I just wanted to make sure that that topic is not covered specifically in the House bill and all of that. That's up to
Correct.
us.
Yep.
Well, item number 3 sounds like affordable housing and income demands. So I heard it again at some parts of the public hearings that we've been having over the last year, that some folks feel that missing middle housing will help solve the affordable housing problem. And I believe, I'm not speaking for the commission, but there are several members here that I know sitting at this dais that don't really believe that, and I personally don't. It would be a rare situation where something that happens according to this new plan is going to really come out with a piece of property that's affordable in
Yeah.
Kenmore.
I think the way that you have to think about this is, I mean, there is under the regulations, the 4 units, if one is affordable, if that pencils, that will happen. But people are conflating these things. Providing more housing over time can help with the supply and demand. And if everybody was doing that, that could help with increasing supply. But again, don't think of this as, this is in isolation of all the planning that communities are doing for housing. So there's lots of planning going around in the cities around you and here for housing that does fit that bill. So I think in totality, you're planning for a variety of housing types for people making different income levels and providing more housing choices. This is one of those choices, but it's not as if to fulfill all of our housing mandates, we're looking at middle housing ordinances. Nope, it's a very small piece of the puzzle. The other would be, multifamily and tools that provide more affordable housing. It would be all of those things. So yeah, those things do get talked about together. And there may be a little bit of connection, but this legislation wasn't focused on affordable housing in terms of providing like under 50% AMI housing or under 80% AMI housing.
Well, that's what I've heard before. And I like the way you said it's a part of the big pie in Kenmore, but it's not going to solve affordable housing alone. And I think that our constituents need to clearly understand so that there's not this, we're going to do all kinds of things that they could throw to derail this whole endeavor. So I promised 4 points. So the fourth point is has to do with the politics of this. We were talking about, well, we'll call it this model. And then there's the next steps. Well, I think for some of us, thinking about those next steps is just hunky-dory. But to put that kind of perspective in writing that this is the first step of many steps gives the public a view that we are going on with this, that much beyond where we are contemplating now. And what the city council found out was after we spent all this time the first time around and decided to do it on a 1/4 mile of the transit area lines as an incremental step, full knowing that this was coming. They went out and decided to implement the whole thing all at once, and it was a very nasty affair. And I personally wouldn't want them to have to go about seeing that situation again. So that's why I'm a little skeptical of how we present it, because this is a big step in a lot of people's view. And we got to, a lot of us have a vision of the future, but I don't want to confuse people that not only do you get this, but you get the rest of our vision too. It's just coming your way. I'm sorry, but I think that a lot of folks see it that way these days. And I want to make sure that we project and we get through what we want through so that it can be passed by our council without too much hoopla.
Cool.
I think it's a good point, the politics. I fear though, especially because this is an election year and it's going to get very fractious. I don't know there's a way for us to avoid things getting heated. I think communication is all we can, like we can communicate clearly. We can have good intent and we can just do what's right. I don't know that we can control what happens in terms of how further is riled up, to be frank, which is a sad thing to say, but I think realistic at the same time. So as much as I think we can try and do our best with communication and try and really push forward that we do have good intent for everyone, I think there are those that are going to misconstrue, and I don't know that we can control that.
Well, that's a very fair point. And we can try to do the right thing and it will come out the way it does. And I agree with you. You never know the consequences. Anyone else? Okay. Oh.
Not to push this any too much further, but I think what's true here is that there's a lot of anxiety out there. There's a lot of anxiety among people sitting up here about where this is going. So I think part of what we have to do is we have to figure out how do we address that anxiety. And one of the things that comes to my mind, helpful or not, is whenever I read into this, when we went through this at the beginning, a year or more ago, and again, I don't understand what the goal is. And when I say a goal, I mean specific numbers. Are we looking to develop rules that are going to maximize to give us as many duplexes as we possibly can have in the city? Or is it something else? That helps us, I think, be able to communicate to the community about where this is going. What is it really, what does this really look like? Because I've heard lots of conversation about, well, you know, this probably is a small thing. Well, how do we communicate? Or is it a large thing? What are we trying to accomplish here? And I don't think we're real clear about what that goal is. Because until you know that, you can't balance against the environmental concerns. You can't be talking about what's the impact on our parks, what's the impacts on our roads, all of these things that are going to be impacted. Is this something that's going to have an impact on these things? How do these things link together? Until we have, at least in my mind, an idea of where we're going here, and it's a number, we would expect to see, given looking today at our city, it has a capacity to add X number of middle housing units. It's a guess. And if we work at this and we do this in a reasonable way, you could expect to see something like this number over the next X number of years. I think that would help reduce people's anxiety. I think it would also help us when we look at the development rules about how do we put those together? Where do we need to put special attention to make sure that we're not opening this up to much larger than what we intended or much smaller than what we intended. But right now, I don't know how to judge that because I don't know where we're going.
Well, I think maybe I could answer just really quick. I think in terms of the communication,
Play out.
you just have to acknowledge that change is really tough and you have to lead with empathy and understanding. And, you know, I'm not living through somebody else's lens. And so when we're putting together regulations, it's okay to acknowledge like growth is really tough. The community is changing and it's okay no one's wrong with the feelings that they've shared as part of this process. So if I understand that, then it'd be like, we have this grounding of some common understanding that like, these are really tough issues and then it's communicating them. So I'll do a little, just to kind of address a little bit. So the way we framed up the open house, one, giving people some knowledge about what the state law requirements are. You know, is this Kenmore doing this to us or is this the state law? Providing frequently asked questions so you can answer people's questions up front. Can we avoid critical areas regulations and develop new homes? No, you cannot. Let's make sure we're answering people's questions and then walk through what these regulations do, understand the choices that the cities have, ask for feedback on those things. And then at some point you have to make sometimes what are tough decisions. The goal is that maybe you can answer people's questions, even if they're not satisfied, but you can answer their questions. You can give them opportunities for input. That input is considered. So I'd say our process is very deliberate. What we're doing right here is a result of the Growth Management Act. And I think at the high level, there was decision, over 30 years ago that growth would be focused more internally than in rural areas and farms and forests.
That's true.
We're adding 1.8 million people to the King, Pierce, Snohomish, Kitsap County areas between 2017 and 2050. That means communities are going to be changing. The amount of housing that you're going to expect is going to be related to the growth target that you have for your city, which is part of your comprehensive plan update. So I think we can answer these questions for people and break them down. It is really complex. So we're trying to figure out what do people really want to know about, and how can we answer those questions in a way that, you know, gives them information without having to be planning experts.
Clay,
Have any-
just a quick question. I know you brought up the open house. There were 60 people that attended the open house, and there was less than half of 1%. And this is a issue that will impact a huge this community as a whole. Are there plans for us to get more community engagement, more community involvement, have more people involved in these open houses and forums? Because 60 people is just, I don't think that represents all of Kenmore here. It's with 25,000.
No.
And I'll be first, I was not present either, so I'll be the first to say that. But yeah, I mean, are there plans for us to be able to get more community involvement?
The short answer is yes. I think you will never get 25,000 people engaged in a project. And I think that people who are engaged, either they care broadly about the topic, or they take it down to a personal level and it's like, how can I do it? Or I'm concerned that it's going to happen. So depending on how people are engaged, it depends on what their motives are for engagement. And we try and look for a broad way to get that engagement. The open house was kind of like an education piece. It was kind of outlining, which Clay's eventually going to get into here, some of the key questions that we asked at the open house and some of the key policy questions that the Planning Commission are going to have to answer. So we had the open house. We will be attending several of the farmers markets. There will be a survey. We're going to keep the website updated. You can see the crowds that are here tonight to hear this discussion. So again, we can kind of try and get as much information out there. The advertisement for the open house went to every household. So every household got an invite. Again, it's looking at people's motivation for attending. So we can do as much as we can. Typically how community engagement goes, it might be pretty light. We might get, you know, lots of people involved. It usually comes down to the last minute when people actually believe that you're going to adopt something. That's when people tend to get excited and come out, which typically happens in front of the council. All we're trying to do from this point to when it gets to the council is make sure we've done as much outreach, communication, information as possible. And it's really getting down to the choices. State law is giving the framework that you have to do something, but there are some choices that can be made to make it more Kenmore-like, if you like. And that's where we're trying to get to, which hopefully then will allay some of those fears. And just because you put regulations in place doesn't mean things are going to happen. It's a choice. For when somebody wants to do something different with their property, it provides more choice. Nobody's going out there telling you you have to build a duplex. Nobody's out there saying you have to rip your house down. So again, it's sort of, it will be incremental. And this is only one piece of the puzzle, because financing and the builders out there are the other piece which we have less control over. I think you can probably see that there is a market shift going on, which is driven by many things, whether it's a change in demographics or people looking for more small housing choice, but the finance market and the building market all have to line up, and we have just one piece of that. So even if we adopt regulations at the end of this year or by June of next year, the changes that you will see in terms of those kind of units being built will be, I would predict, pretty incremental.
Yeah, and I think just one more thing. You have been talking about middle housing for an awful long time. You had phase one. We did community outreach, did surveys. There was outreach to communities that are impacted by land use decisions, like specific type of outreach. You had code amendments that preceded that had a long, strong interest. I mean, my feeling is there's not a shortage of people understanding that you're looking at development regulations. And I think that over time, there's also some understanding of what you're doing and why you're doing it. Like, I mean, it's been communication and communication and communication and communication. So, I mean, I think there's opportunities to keep informing before we get to public meetings and hearings on the code. But this process didn't start with this project. It's been happening for several years. So, I mean, I think that, from an outside perspective, and I work with a lot of communities, this community's done a really good job, like sending notice to every single person, household in the city that there's an open house. That's pretty rare. So, again, providing people opportunities to get involved, and we'll continue to do that.
Well, Clay, I just wanted to clarify something
Mhm.
for you. That, Deb mentioned the large number of people that we always have here at the Planning Commission to watch and talk to us. Well, this last year, we co-opted half of the audience was almost here. Him and one other person would be here half the time. So the council in their wisdom decided to put him on the other side of the dais.
Yeah, that's
So,
great.
I just thought I'd point that out. And you brought up another item that I think is really important. It's educational, and I think, to take Deb's point, is it may not make any change at all, but maybe a 1-page, two pages of an explanation to our constituents of how these numbers, because it goes through the public PSRC and then down to the counties, well, from the state to the PSRC to the counties, and who then divided up into little areas like ours. And that we don't have a choice in that. And a lot of folks have no clue that we really don't have a choice. And this is one of the methodologies that the state is saying that we should use to help make our quota. And
Absolutely. If we can get that understanding of the things that you're required to do, then we can focus on the things where you could make it uniquely Kenmore.
Because we get hit on that, even at this level a lot. So that would, and frankly, that would be helpful in a lot of different aspects of what we do, and it'd be something that, because I get asked that every so often, why we don't have to take more people. Yes, you do.
I can get you like a laminated response card you can keep in your pocket.
That's right.
You can pull out and say, all right, it's question 4. I have my answer to that.
That's what the Joint Chiefs of Staff does. They have
See.
several different.
There you go.
coordinates.
See? Well, and part of that is we've, being here, and we did our joint council and planning commission study session. Just wanted to provide a little bit of a recap on what we heard. Obviously we were there and presented. I went back and listened to the record. I'll go back and do that again. But, some of the things that we heard, and this is, again, you're getting all these spectrums. So then you go like, if you're hearing this and you're hearing this, like, how do we get something that's right here? But some of the things we heard about the importance of balancing new housing requirements with environmental standards, and that's been brought up by the Planning Commission tonight. The need to plan for infrastructure improvements, such as sidewalks in neighborhoods where redevelopment has occurred. So those are things that as planners that we do, is try to match when you're going to see development and all the infrastructure that you need. It's a little different when you're doing it with, like, it's infill in existing developed neighborhoods versus greenfield development or larger lot development. Options to incentivize new middle housing that helps accomplish important community goals. So what are the things that you really want to see out of housing, and how do you provide incentives to help developers go, yeah, that would be a good idea if I went and did that, versus building this. Connecting this project with work taking place with the climate action committees and DEIA committee. So, I did go online and take a look at some of the reports, and the climate action plan. There isn't a lot on middle housing in those reports, but in terms of engagement and making sure that they're connected, we'll do that. And how new regulations sync with accessory dwelling unit regulations. So see, we've had all this conversation tonight, and you can see that there's some common themes and threads. It's just really about narrowing some of this down. A little bit of an overview. So I thought that open house, as much as we didn't have hundreds of people there, I thought it was actually really well attended, because the people that are going to come to that meeting are the people that have questions. They want to learn something. They have that burning question, and it provides an opportunity outside of when they can only come for 3 minutes and you're not maybe having dialogue back, and then they leave frustrated. So, the hope is as many people as we can answer their questions or be able to communicate with them before we get to public meetings where you can't have that dialogue, the better, and we'll continue to make that effort. But we set up different stations, and then people had the opportunity to provide feedback. So we kind of went through the new state requirements so people could understand these are the things that the city is required to plan for. And I was at that station for quite a while. And so, I mean, it was really nice to talk to people and say, these are the things we're kind of required to be doing. And this is from a bill, and it's the statute, and walking people through that, getting that, is Kenmore doing this to me, or is this something we're required to be taking a look at? We modeled up frequently asked questions, tried to, from what we've heard from our joint session, but also things, trying to get ahead of, can you build middle housing and avoid important things like critical areas regulations? No, you can't. They still apply, or, those kind of things. So we walk people through those stations, get their questions answered. And then we showed them through maps of where this would apply. And then we also kind of outlined critical areas so people can get a better sense of, when new regulations go in, is this citywide? Is this only in certain communities? Oh, okay, well, if I overlay the critical areas, okay, then there's probably gonna be less development in this portion of the city. We also did some boards, just getting a sense of building on some of the survey questions from phase 1 of understanding if people live in the city of Kenmore. The people that attended, a lot of people that provided feedback do they currently own or rent? A lot of people that own their house. And then what was pretty interesting was, if you wanted to purchase a home in Kenmore, you feel there are enough homes available that you can afford. And I think the feedback that we received that I was substantially no, which was pretty interesting considering, so many people were existing homeowners. Yes.
I realized I answered that question incorrectly.
What's that?
After the fact. I realized I answered that question incorrectly after the fact.
We can move your dot afterwards.
You Photoshop it and shift it. Yeah, no, that being said, it's got a pretty big caveat, which is I think I would have to buy in the manufactured home park. I am renting.
Mhm.
And that's the affordable area I've seen. Perhaps there might be a couple condos that I'm missing that is maybe within my price range. It would be difficult, but I think I put no because I was thinking a home, like a single family home, not necessarily a manufactured home or a condominium. And even under those options, there's some challenges. So, yeah.
And I think it helps you have some conversations with people, like concerns over redevelopment in single family neighborhoods, but then you get in a conversation with, but my kids really would love to find a place to live here, but they can't afford to buy a house. So it's like this whole, like the balancing thing. Well, like, I can understand that redevelopment's going to cause you concerns because that's change in your neighborhood and things like that. But then also, like, how do we provide more, housing options, including, home ownership options within the city? And then you kind of get on terms with people like, this is really tough, isn't it? Like, how do we do this? But I mean, there were some really good conversations with that. We talked a little bit about, about 6 of the 9 housing types and what people would like to see within the city. Just kind of building off some of the things that were done in phase 1. And then we did some trade-off questions, and it really wasn't focused on the particular questions we asked, but really I'm just trying to get a sense of whether people are interested in that kind of trade-offs. Like, how do we balance the regulations to get what you want? Like, you need to support providing more options in exchange if you provided a little more parking in some areas of the city, because we heard people talking about parking. So one of the things that was interesting, we talked about cottage housing. People were interested in cottage housing, but we're not interested in providing flexibility in the development regulations. But that's really important, because I think, at least in my viewpoint, you're not going to see a lot of cottage housing if you it's the same density, same parking requirements as, if you wanted to build a 3,500 square foot home, or, if it's $300,000 just to purchase a lot, you're probably not going to build an 800 square foot home in the middle of it. So, this is kind of like, so if you go, do we want a cottage housing code? I still don't know, because, we could put one together I just would, do you want something on the books that's not gonna be utilized? So it's fun. I mean, it's kind of interesting to have these conversations. I think this is like the ballpark where hopefully we get is just talking about what are these trade-offs? What are the incentives? What are the things that we could be looking at? And then we provided like kind of last as an opportunity, like if we didn't cover anything for you tonight, like what questions do you have? And so, we got good feedback. Balance increased housing with open space, middle housing, affordable housing is essential for being able to live in Kenmore. Public transit is essential to support increased densities. Questions about excluding the R1 from middle housing requirements because there's a lot of critical areas there. And new middle housing should be shared equally between neighborhoods. So pretty balanced kind of conversations and questions that people had. Some were really interested in providing more housing options. Some just had concerns about what it would mean to them or their neighborhood or their neighbors in the city as a whole. So yes.
I had a question on the bullet point of can we exclude the R1 from middle housing requirements? I also was not at that event, but I'm wondering, was that coming from the people who were there representing R1 lots? Or was that a question posed by people concerned about the sensitive or critical areas?
I think that was the person that I talked to was somebody that lived in the R1 zone. But I think you could get a balance of if you're really concerned about critical areas, that a lot of times that applies to the R1 zone because that's why you have the R1 zone is because of critical areas. Some of the responses, if it's applied to the R1 zone, it's development still has to comply with your critical areas regulations. So, it's not like a get out of jail free pass to say you can, have to comply with steep slopes or those things.
That caused me to go back and look at the map and notice that the R1 really lays over Swamp Creek and along the river. So I mean, there was almost an identical overlay for those zones.
Yeah, so if you wanted to start penciling out, I mean, this is probably beyond this project, but if you wanted us to pencil out where middle housing is more likely than others, you could start doing kind of like when you do a buildable lands analysis, you could take out certain areas, like you have all of these lots in these 3 zones, and then you can remove areas that are fully encumbered by critical areas. And then you remove lots where, the lots are very small, and you remove ones where, so you can get some characteristics where you can probably start identifying where it's more likely that you're going to see more redevelopment than other areas. And whether those are included or not, you're probably going to see less in those zones, where there's critical areas encumbrances.
You're good. I wasn't sure if I was just supposed to start talking if I don't get your attention. One of the questions I have on that subject with R1 in particular is a lot of the R1 lots, from what I've seen, tend to be larger lots. Would that be something where, at least without currently framed, those lots have the potential to be split? Because I think that's kind of some of the concern behind that is trying to really protect those riparian areas by limiting the type of development happening by these critical areas.
Just to answer that, you'd be looking at, if it's a 1 acre density now, that potentially that would be a ½ acre density. But anybody that's proposing a home is still going to have to comply with any of those regulations. So if they don't have that room to meet those critical area standards, then it wouldn't be approved.
I see. So they could, if we don't change the density requirements at these locations, if we leave it at 1 unit an acre as it currently is, right? And I think
then you could have 1 additional per lot. So it's not going to increase. Yeah.
You'd have two units at most. And even if they split the lot, they could still only have 2
and
because
4 if you had affordable, correct?
4
if
if
they
and they're within the
was
transit.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Within the quarter mile, which is like 1 lot, 2 lots.
So I thought this went really well. It was good to be able to connect with the community. And again, this kind of frames up how you can try to not have the message board at the first station, tell me about all your concerns, but try to get the first one of, here's some of the facts. And, part of it was like, here's what this project isn't. We're not doing this and we're not proposing this. And so as much as we can dispel rumors and not have those start, then hopefully people will have a general, understanding of what we're doing, why we're doing it, who we're doing it for, and can kind of follow that, so. So just a little bit of a policy discussion. So part of this is the comprehensive plan process is moving. We're going to be bringing policies later this summer for the housing element, really just focused on middle housing because the housing element's already been updated. We did in phase one, we identified a couple of policy areas where we could modify some policies, but it's pretty light because you've done all the work. So then you get into when you're looking at kind of how you want to frame up regulations, are there policies that we could put together as drafts that would then could help support regulation implementation? So you usually want to have policies and you get to implement them through your development standards. So doesn't mean you have to do it all the time, but it depends on the way the policy are framed. So let's just think about, we could put together draft policies that would encourage the use of incentives to try to get development that would kind of meet the vision for the city. It got brought up doing a permit ready program. I gave you a link in your packet that like the city of Renton, city of Seattle, others, they have programs where they have plan sets all ready to go. They're designed, people can come in, they can pick those plans, they can build those homes. That would allow you, it's a lower cost for people that want to build. They know they can build those units. Also, you can make sure that those designs are things that you're wanting to see. Renton's, there's the kind of, they have a whole bunch of models. But they're focused on ADUs, but you could have something like that in the future focused on different building types. So you could have a policy that would say explore putting together a permit ready program for middle housing and accessory dwelling units in the future.
How
Doesn't
much
commit
does
you.
something like that cost to do?
I'd have to talk to the cities. I mean, I think that you have to purchase the plan sets, the website, the maintenance. I mean, I think that there's some cost for it. I think it's balanced with, making it more efficient, easier for people to get permits, and, getting the type of development that aligns with what you want to see. So we could certainly explore that if you wanted to have that type of policy. It wouldn't commit you to doing something next week. It would just be expressing the extension that maybe that's something you want to look at in the future.
Assume it's okay to talk. I'm pretty interested in at least exploring permit ready programs. There's, speaking of cost, often significant cost associated with getting design, going to review, all of these processes. I see it being harder for some types of housing, especially cottage housing and other forms that are going to be much more site specific. Although even for those, it could be potentially a bunch of duplex. I mean, maybe not duplexes because it's cottages, but something along those lines, right? So I just wanted to express interest in that. I am interested in development incentives versus static standards as well. I think that those can be very useful if done properly. Kind of actually going back to the tree comment and tree concern, one concern I have is I kind of agreed with the association for King County and Snohomish, the Master Building Association, with the assessment of tree canopy. And I mean, I have disagreements on that, but what I see potentially is areas where you might need to remove one tree to build additional housing not being built because there's a tree there. And instead we're going to be building closer to, a critical area across the street where we aren't in R1, wherever those densities allow instead, because there isn't a tree there, or we're going to be building on a hillside and worsening stormwater because we're increasing densities on hillsides and pushing that all down to the bottom. Things like that. So that's a concern I have with that. But on the other hand, I want to protect riparian areas and trees. And so it's a hard balance there for me on that. But I'm worried about dramatically limiting that ability. I'm not sure what the line is, but it's something I wanted to mention. Another one, I'm just going to go through all these bullets because I was looking at them and I wrote down some thoughts, was the preservation of existing housing. I really like that. concept for a number of reasons. That being said, there's some drawbacks that I've seen with that. One of them is generally you have additional curb cuts and driveways as a result, especially if we don't have street parking or we're limiting parking for those developments. If we do, going back to the Master Builders Association, they were talking about, a 10-foot driveway. While I like having very narrow driveways, a concern I have with those is you have someone parked there and you've got a building in the back and it's difficult for a fire truck to get through. So perhaps allowing things like that, but looking at, in order to do this, you have to have a through connection. So there's two ways on that road, right? If you're stuck on one end, the fire truck can go around the block and come up the other or something along those lines, making it more like an alley. That's just an example. There's other ways of looking at it. And then future, going on to the next bullet, future capital facility investments such as sidewalks. It seems to me like some of the housing types that we choose to be allowed on the parcel, it doesn't have to, we get to pick, right? Or I guess not we, but the city code would define which parcels have which of the 6 housing types that were required, and that can vary throughout the city. So for something along these lines, we could potentially tailor the housing types that we're allowing on a lot to be in line with capital improvements or improvements that have already been made, right? So perhaps 6 plexes, for example, on roadways adjacent to 68th where sidewalk improvements have been completed or are planned to be completed in the near future.
And some of it could also be just, some of this is difficult because if you were saying like there's no sidewalks in a neighborhood and every time someone develops, they've got to do their own frontage improvements. You might have 10 or 15 years between houses next door and doing improvements. So it's also thinking about making the city making capital facility investments where, people as they redevelop can pay in through latecomers agreements and other things of just thinking like, you got to weigh like, what does the developer put in versus, where does the city put in improvements? But then you have to plan for them and you've got to get them in your plan and things like, so is there some kind of policy to start thinking about, infill redevelopment and kind of the impacts on capital facilities and utilities and parks and all the other things as well, so.
That's exactly the direction I was thinking.
Perfect.
Yeah, and then the last one, corner commercial nodes. I know it's not a part of this directly, but I think it's something that perhaps we don't need to put in now because it's not going to matter really until we have the infill beginning. But it's something that I'm glad to see being thought about. And I guess before I cut off, back to Commissioner Vanderlin's point earlier about kind of setting a goal or an expectation. I think for me, at least, missing middle housing is kind of difficult to do in a developed area. It, in many ways, is the lack of housing types that would have made economic sense at the time of construction for a region that didn't make sense because we had restrictive zoning codes. And to go back in retroactively and say, okay, we're going to allow this, but we're not going to have any additional flexibility beyond single family home zoning, makes it very difficult to actually see that diversity come into fruition. And on the other hand, if you go too far, you don't have diversity, you just have higher density monocultures again, where instead of single family housing, they're all, triplexes and slot homes, right? And I don't want to see that either. So to me, it is, how do you get that, what would have been a more natural, comfortable environment that might have been created back while getting infill, moderately increasing density around urban centers and cores. That's how I view it, at least. But anyways.
That's great. I mean, I guess what I'm asking, because you're not making any decision like, oh, if we give you direction to put together a policy or two focused on certain things, doesn't commit you to any, but it's when we come back with the comprehensive plan, do you want to see some different policy categories, a few policies that would then help be supported if you took a certain approach with your development regulations? So any of these, are there other things or ideas or things that you really want to make sure we're talking about?
We're gonna hop to the other end.
And then-
Commissioner Dorian.
Yeah, I think I was having a similar thought to Commissioner Olson, that there's kind of a spectrum from just allowing these housing types, which we have to a certain degree or another, through to kind of enabling them and then incenting them. And I think I get less comfortable once we get to incenting, to be honest with you, because this is, we want it to be a housing choice, and it is kind of a different choice for single family neighborhoods today. We're opening that up. But I think there's that balance of enabling that to be organic, because we want this to be market driven, versus incenting the building of them, because again, they're not necessarily core to our targets for providing housing units. Like our targets are at the more affordable end. So unless they're going to be I would be more for incenting affordable versions of middle housing, but I don't know that we specifically need to incent folks to develop this, because if the market's there and if the market develops for it, they'll build it and they'll make a ton of profit without having to have government underwrite it in various different ways. So that's kind of where I think about that. But in terms of enabling, like I think things like the permit ready is great, like making it easy to say, yes, you can do this, versus just you're allowed, but we're not going to give you any guidance as to what that's going to look like. I feel like that's good. The other thing that I've been thinking of is I got in touch with my HOA, because we do have CC&Rs that preclude that. So we would be one of the areas in Kenmore Row, although technically the underlying zoning would allow it. You wouldn't be able to build either ADUs or middle housing within my HOA. I think there's things we might do on that enablement front with HOAs again. And again, this is tricky, because I'm not saying government should subsidize HOAs, but the thing that was pushed back to me was, it's going to be expensive for the HOAs to do, because they have to go and they have to get those CC&Rs rewritten. There's legal costs to that, and that they have to get a super majority of the HOA to vote for it. But if there are things that we can do to enable HOAs to engage in the conversation, that might be interesting, because I'd love to see, and I know it doesn't exist, but I'd love to see an overlay map of HOAs in there, which will actually preclude any of this being built as well, because I suspect there's quite a lot of land that would be taken up with those pieces.
I just want to drill down a little bit more on
Yep.
that. I wasn't thinking like incentives, like density bonuses. Maybe that would be that other project sometime in the future, but more thinking about like trade-offs. Like I heard concerns about there's, you can have 2 parking spaces for lots that start out at 6,000 square feet or greater. You can only require 1 parking space for lots that start out at under 6,000 square feet. So I heard from some community members who are saying like, boy, that's not a lot of parking spaces if you're in an area that's a long way from transit. So like an incentive would be, if you provide 2 parking spaces, you can get 5 feet closer to the rear property line, or you pick some different things, like a selection of, so it's part of that would be like, the market changes, but codes are static. And so, are you open to like thinking about like how they select 2 or 3 things and it allows them to get X, which may be something that would be good for the community, but so it could be, it's height versus impervious services. It could be setbacks. It could be parking. It could be some things where you can just provide some flexibility when it's hitting some things that you're wanting to see. Design,
Yeah,
that kind of thing.
I like that. I mean, I think I've seen other ideas which I'm less keen on, like remove impact fees. It's like you're not building affordable housing. I don't know why I would remove your impact fees, but
That's a requirement for the ADU is 50%, but
Okay.
If they're applied, but yeah. But yes, I think we can focus. I think the policy I'm thinking general policy, and then you could be more specific when we work on the regulations, and then you can say, no, this doesn't end up working for us, but at least you're working through, like, we're listening to the community, you're saying you're concerned about these things, but you really like these things, like, how do we get there? That's one vehicle to get there. But I appreciate that feedback. That's great.
Mr. Vanderling.
I share some of your concern, Mr. Dorian, with the development incentives, maybe in a little different way. Yeah, I understand how you have trade-offs, but depending on what type of trade-off it is, it may be of advantage to whoever is doing the development, but a disadvantage to the neighbors. If you reduce the setbacks to advantage provide an advantage for the the party is that's developing it, but everybody around them loses 5 feet of setback. I'm not sure that may be an incentive for the developer, but I'm not sure it's good for the community. And having to make those kinds of decisions, who's going to make those kind of decisions you go along is
Well, I think that
difficult.
the way the code would be here's an option, like, you want to help preserve existing housing, but when you do that, then you have to build further in the rear of a lot, which means you might run into rear setbacks, or you may disincentivize the thing that you're trying to incentivize, which means maybe the only way somebody can develop is to tear down the existing home and put a home in that footprint with a duplex. Maybe that's a good thing, because like you said, you can get one access point, you can make it look like one home, you can do those, but sometimes you might actually work against yourself. So you're trying to think, if you're trying to encourage that single family home retention, is there something you can make it so they can actually build that second unit? I mean, that's the kind of range of things we're talking about.
I said that sort of trade-off, it tends to be on a one-on-one decision. Each one of them becomes a negotiation in itself, or a decision in itself. So I think having some clear standards to start with is important. I think if we go through and have a discussion, a policy discussion about what are our priority trade-offs. So yes, parking is an important trade-off for us. So maybe we would consider this something else, a high priority. If they're willing to do something with landscaping that would benefit the natural environment, we might consider that. But I think as a general policy, development incentives is a sticky place to go. But I'd certainly be willing to entertain what some of those policy alternatives be, and we can have a discussion about that. The other piece of the future capital facility investment. As a policy, I think the developer has to take on the responsibility for that new infrastructure that's required for their development. I also agree that it doesn't help us to have 10 feet of sidewalk surrounded by 50 feet of nothing. So I think having that donated into a city fund that funds an existing project that's a multi-year that provides this infrastructure, and this is the way we finance it, I think that's a reasonable approach. I could see that. Corner commercial nodes is a whole nother discussion.
I figured
I don't want to
because
get into that.
Came up in phase 1. It's come up with something that, if we got the permission, since we're opening up the housing, I mean, you could have something about, it could even be something you consider the connection of, small commercial nodes with housing densities, and, so we could find some. I can propose something and then you can say, nah, or yeah, that sounds pretty good. Maybe it's something we want to take up in the future, and then we'll have the policy support for it.
Permit-ready programs. We actually had a discussion of this when we went through our ADUs discussion a year or so ago. And I think in our context of ADUs, it makes sense. You've got a smaller, more standardizable structure. But for a missing middle, that just seems to me that would be too complex. I'm not sure what the value of that would be, but see what other commissioners think. So,
Commissioner Banzinski?
On incentivizing middle housing, I largely agree with Commissioner Dorian. I largely feel like the market should take care of that, and that I feel uncomfortable about subsidizing and over subsidizing housing that will not be affordable housing, since this is more about choice and not affordability. And I in particular do not want to incentivize the increase in impervious surfaces. That's something I want to disincentivize. And then I'm going to share some anecdotal observations and hope that they kind of all will weave together with my central point here, which is one, I lived for a while on the East Coast in a neighborhood that had a diversity of housing types in it. It was an older, New England neighborhood that had large homes. Some of them had been subdivided into apartments, so there were 3 units in each home. Some of them had remained single family homes, so there was a mix of rentals with 3 units. Some were single family homes. There were corner stores that had apartments above them. There were corner stores that were not on the corner, but in the middle of the block. You know, I could walk to, like, there was a liquor store next to me, and then there was a little grocery store that was in a home, you know, looking structure right next to that. And there was even a larger kind of a New York style, like walk-up kind of apartment that had a, you know, inner courtyard. So it was really vibrant. There was diversity of housing choice. I think that kind of diversity is generally a positive thing, kind of in the natural world and for us humans as well. And then when I go out, you know, into Kitsap, you know, rural Kitsap, or out even in rural King County, it makes sense that we should have more dense housing choices here inside the urban growth boundary, because as the kind of writers of that policy kind of foresaw, is that, like, if we don't kind of contain our growth, we'll sprawl into those natural areas and we'll lose something. So I think I like what you're saying about visioning for our community. I think it makes a lot of sense to to imagine like what we could be and how growth here could be vibrant and create vibrant communities. We are in a climate crisis and a housing crisis. And so I feel like it behooves us to address these kinds of things with those things top of mind. That could, because I do think they are related. And that said, I think we need to plan not only for housing, but for habitat corridors. I think that one thing that the urban growth boundary and area and that concept has not gotten right is our protection of our environment inside the urban growth boundary. It is just as important as the environment outside the urban growth boundary. Salmon are a critical species for the Pacific Northwest. They're very important culturally, and they're part of us. It's part of what makes the Pacific Northwest us. I know there are people who talk to me about salmon runs that used to exist, like within recent memory. 20 years ago, Swamp Creek full of salmon. Like 20 years ago, Cedar River, you could walk across the backs of salmon, and they're not coming back in the same numbers. Every salmon who comes to our watershed has to swim through the urban growth area, right? So we can't neglect the rivers and streams here, which is why I would love to see us start to think about not only where we put our density, being very intentional about that inside the urban growth area, and also planning for not just that, but planning for robust habitat corridors. And in Kenmore, I see that happening on the Swamp Creek corridor, around the Swamp Creek wetland, and on the Sammamish River. And that's exactly where our R1 is a lot about, I think, protecting Swamp Creek. I don't think our critical areas regulations and ordinances are doing enough to protect our environment, which is why I would love to see us start to plan more robustly in certain corridors for environmental concerns. The more density, even if it's just an increase in one home, the more density you put there, the harder it is going to be to undo it. And that's what we're spending a lot of time doing right now, is undoing the legacy of bad development so that we have a chance of recovering salmon. So I would personally not want to put any more density in our R1. And I would like to put it other places though, right? Not R1, but in other places. It looks like the critical areas would preclude denser development in R1, but the overlap doesn't look perfect to me. So that's something I would like to take a look at. And then lastly, I just want to make the point, the reason I speak about salmon is because they are a keystone species. Their decline is an indication of all sorts of other declines. Their decline is related to the decline of the southern resident killer whales. It's going to be related to our own decline. Like, if we don't care for our environment, we're not caring for ourselves. So I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Can I ask you just a follow-up question though? Maybe
Yeah.
incentives, because when Commissioner Dorian, when you're asking, I think maybe incentives is the wrong word. Just maybe it's trying to make the regulations work, because static regulations are hard, because you're talking about environmental regulations. So, and we're talking about middle housing. So in lieu of just adding on more buffers or requirements, are there tangible things you can think of that someone that's building new housing could do that you would like to see that would be outside of what's already required by the code? And then when I think that, you go, okay, if they are doing these, then that's that trade-off. It's not incentives, you're not getting more, you're not subsidizing development, but what kind of standards or things would you like to see besides more buffers and
I
setbacks?
personally would rather see us building, it's complicated, I think it's nuanced, but on the whole, I'd rather see us building up than out. Because when you're building up, you're housing more people with less impervious surface than building out. And to house the same number of people.
Less impervious, maybe allow taller building heights if you have less impervious surface on lots.
I don't know if I want to commit to that right now, but that's an interesting
Well, we've
idea.
already allowed that in the TOD type area.
Yeah,
And some of us voted for that because of that exact thing, building up and not out. I'd like to do, not we, I'd like to see a urban growth boundary inside of the city of Kenmore.
which is not dissimilar from the idea I'm talking about. I guess what I would like to see though is just like you were talking about using the base density as a way to increase density. I would like us to look at areas that are critical to our environment where we just say we're not going to increase the density there. Because if we do and we get more development there, it is going to be harder to undo. If we can leave the density low, perhaps there could be a future condition under which some of that property could come into public ownership and we could create a really beautiful, again, habitat corridor through those areas. But the more density we put there, the harder that is going to become.
I think I was interpreting incentives as trade-offs when I read that.
And that's what I think I'm
Yeah.
hearing is in trade-off may be better than using the word incentives means
It-
subsidizing developers.
And having done parking counts at work for a job, when you're doing a project and you have, let's say, a minimum parking requirement, if you can't hit that requirement, it becomes a really big deal. And the rest of the design often bends over backwards to meet those requirements, even if it doesn't actually make sense for the quality or for good design to be done, right? You might end up seeing, actually, I've got great examples of this all over the city. Go to a drive-through and look for a parking space in a drive-through where you have to back out into the drive-through to go out the rest of the way through the drive-through because you have to meet that one extra parking space that was probably required. So I think that's the reason why I'm interested in these trade-offs. Another example to me would be the tree ordinance. Perhaps having a trade-off where, okay, there is a tree on this lot that's going to limit what can be done on this lot. So in order to make it a viable development project, allowing 35-foot building heights or something along those lines on those lots, if those trees are protected. But we wouldn't do it if they have to remove a tree, for instance. Things like that, right? Where we're saying these are our priorities. Let's make it so that these priorities are not limiting each other because they're in conflict at times, right? How do we address that? So that doesn't mean that we have, a blanket 25-foot or 35-foot building height, for instance. Although personally, I wouldn't necessarily be against that. But instead we're saying, okay, it's going to be 25 feet for this lot because, well, there's no trees here, so you don't get that incentive, but you're going to have less land to build on for these trees. So we'll let you build taller so that you can actually make it work, for instance. That's the type of thing I'm interested in. I'm also interested in limiting, I wouldn't necessarily call it impervious surface area because we have property that is poorly draining, right? Where it doesn't drain very well. And so it might not be impervious, but it's not very permeable. So I really look at it more of green space and a balance of green space as you increase density. Maybe not even as you increase density, but just as you increase developed area. Protecting that green space, I think, is important. And so you could have projects where if a greater proportion of the property is green, you let them build taller, for instance, in those types of approaches. So I'm interested in that type of thing because I agree. I want to protect the environment. I want to protect, I want additional housing. I don't want to cut down trees, but I also don't want those things to come at the cost of each other, or perhaps even kind of, you know, shooting ourselves in the foot where we make it so hard to do anything that either nothing happens or very little happens. And then we're like, okay, wait, well, when are we going to see the changes that we were hoping for? So anyways.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair Thompson. Yeah, I agree with Commissioner Olson there about the incentive. I guess if we're going to call it that, should be something that incentivizes something that feels more like the public good, which would be, you know, a retention of trees or green space. And so in that case, I also would say, you know, building a taller building in order to save the tree would be wonderful. The exception being like that, I would like to see that everywhere, but in these planned habitat corridors, right? Like that still feels important to me, the planned habitat corridors. And then finding ways to allow greater density again in other areas. Yeah, and I'm interested into form, you know, over yeah, a strict kind of concern about the number of units. Because I think there are lots of different building forms that can fit into our neighborhoods and grow well with our neighborhoods.
You're done?
I can speak later unless you're going to adjourn things.
I think from just perspective for me, just getting some ideas, because we're going to get you draft policies and then we'll work on them and say, how come you didn't do this? Or we should be thinking more towards this, but at least just keeping that conversation. Because the other option is you just apply the current regulations that apply to single family housing to middle housing. And you just connect those. What that's going to result though, is you're not going to be there's going to be lots of lots where you could build something where you can't. It may you know, so I think this is trying to like, try to think about ways where you can anticipate some of those situations that might come up where you can get the housing, but you can also maybe retain trees or plant more trees or, you know, have parking that's necessary for neighborhood. So.
Commissioner Dorian.
On the parking front, just looking around at a few things, is it right that there can be no off-street parking required within half a mile of a major transit stop for middle housing? Is that correct? So, because that's quite large, so that, because we saw the map with the line for quarter mile, and that's already going to be very different from single family there, right? I don't think we have single family code that would allow no off-street parking with single family
Correct, so
homes.
that's
Yeah.
gonna have to change. So
Yeah.
this is one of those things where you go, but maybe you could provide us something that says, maybe if we want to see one parking space or in areas that are further from transit,
Mhm.
because there are some of the areas where you have to limit it to one parking space. And maybe if you're wanting to see two, then you would say, you know, there's ways to, you can't require it, but you could.
Commissioner Vanderleen.
What occurred to me is listening to the rest of this latest conversations. Again, I think we don't really have a sense of what our goal is. I mean, how far do we need to bend over to incentivize or to encourage development? If a lot has constraints on it that would cause us to lose some public value, just take a tree or something else, do we have to do that? I think we have to consider that. But again, we need to understand just what our goal is and how much missing middle do we need to want to have here. If we want to have a lot, we're going to need to have more flexibility to improve the chances of development. If we can achieve that goal without that sort of loss, why wouldn't we do that? But we don't know. So we're planning here to come up with the most flexibility that we possibly can, or at least what we might upfront think is reasonable. But how do we do that if we don't know what the goal is? So I'm concerned about that. The other thing, and Debbie's going to kill me for probably saying this, but when we talk about the things that we're not being able to achieve here, which seem to be goals, affordability, building up rather than out, multifamily, high rise, in the TOD, in downtown, along 522. This is a conversation we had the last time we brought this up, and it was our proposal. To the extent that we can build multifamily, high rise, that's near the transit area, which is within walking distance of most services, you can provide, I think, a lot of the goals we wanted to get out of missing middle without necessarily disrupting to a large extent the rest of our town. I think we have to maybe bring that back into the discussion, and that get again to the goal. So I'll stop there, and I know this is expanding beyond what our scope is, but I just don't see how you answer one without getting into discussing the other.
But you did actually hit exactly the thing that you're deciding on. You're gonna have to permit middle housing in these zones, a certain amount of units, reduce parking, do all these things. Is the goal to just apply the regulations that apply to existing single family home right now and say that's it, and if it can be built, it can be built? Or are you looking for something, it's not necessarily opening any big doors, but are you trying to do something a little bit beyond that? I mean, that will tell you what your goals are, because the way the statute's set up is you can't apply standards more strict than applied to single family. That's kind of a weird standard, honestly, because the setbacks that apply to one single family on a lot are not necessarily what you would typically apply to two homes on a lot or a duplex on a lot, parking, some other things. However, that is the choice in front of you. Do the minimal that's required by state law, see how things go. Try to more focus on things that you really want to see and figure out how you design the code around it.
I'll just jump out and say, yeah, I'm more in favor of creating a kind of a general rule that says we develop based upon current single family standards.
Okay.
And that may be the first step in an evolution that takes us somewhere else over time. But I think if we start there, we're creating potential for an incremental approach with the least disruption of our current land use. If we combine that with the idea that we'll have more dense in the areas that we've already talked about, I think we can achieve these goals, and we don't need to have, and it's aggressive missing middle requirements or trade-offs in lots that are suboptimal for development as missing middle when we don't really need them.
Commissioner Banzinski.
My concern, and maybe Commissioner Vanderlyn, you can tell me if I'm misunderstanding, but my concern is that if we don't take this opportunity to envision what we want our community to look like and kind of tailor what we do to that vision, if we simply use the state requirements and apply them to all single family zones, we will miss an opportunity, because I do feel like the twin crises we're in, the climate crisis and the housing crisis, are entwined, they're related. And I feel like we need to start thinking in a bigger visionary way about both how we provide housing and how we live with our environment if we're going to have any chance of getting out of these crises unscathed. Well, we're already scathed, if we have a chance of surviving them. I don't mean to be too dire, but I feel like that's the reality when you look at what climate scientists are saying. Yeah, so I don't know, maybe I misunderstood though.
Well, I think there's more discussion that has to happen here. When I think about the idea that missing middle development would have to meet the same standards, particularly footprint, setbacks, these things that you would have for missing middle on the same lot, that doesn't preclude you at all from having a missing middle solution. What it's saying is that you're going to have to figure out how to develop that so that you don't have, you maintain for instance, setback requirement, height requirements or whatnot to maintain something that looks like it's compatible with a single family neighborhood, but it doesn't say you don't develop missing middle. So I think it has the potential, would get us to a point where we can provide additional housing units. What we would do it in a way that is incremental, that doesn't necessarily disrupt our current standards. And if we combine that with the idea that we're going to provide high density districts in which we would build, we would actually incentivize affordable housing that would also protect the environment, because we're going to be putting our density concentrating in a single, more concentrated place. I think we can achieve those goals. And I think we can do it in a way that allows us to plan for this, not only to beginning as a base, but also as we go into the future. If we say something like within a quarter mile or a half mile of the major transit district, we're going to allow and incentivize multifamily, high-rise multifamily. That doesn't mean it couldn't be 3/4 of a mile 5 years from now, but we can get into it in a way that's going to make sense, a way that we can begin to develop the infrastructure that would make that sensible. So what I'm doing is, in my mind, is trying to come up with a way that we can do this in an incremental fashion that meets our the city's financial requirements, meets the state's requirements, but also benefits both our existing citizens, but also provides housing for new ones. And I think there's a lot of trade-offs in there. And I think the danger here is to get too far ahead in any one thing that would have an adverse effect on something else we care about. So I'm always in favor of an incremental approach that allows us to discover and work this out as we go along.
Commissioner Dorian.
I think one thing that might be helpful for me is just a crosswalk maybe between what some of these trade-offs could be.
Yeah.
So from like the model ordinance from Commerce, for example, like some of these things, I just don't know. Like in the model ordinance, they say maximum building height 35 feet. I don't know what our current maximum building height is, so I don't know if that is a trade-off or if it isn't. And the setbacks they're proposing 15 feet, except 10 feet for lots with a unit density of 3 or more. Like, well, obviously that's not in our code yet because we don't have a unit density of 3 or more. But like, how that differs from what the single family code is currently, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think the policy will be a little higher level, but I think at some point your decision will be based upon what would this actually mean, or how would it apply, or what would it do, and what's feasible. So I think doing that kind of matched up with the site, doing a couple of site plans for you to kind of show why you might want to consider these things, and then you could just make a policy choice.
I guess what I would not like to see is that we are continuing the same pattern of development that we have been living with for the past 60 years, where we're simply getting like now duplexes instead of single family homes. Because in my mind, all that's going to do is put more people into the same space who are going to need to get into their cars to drive places. And that pattern of development has been disastrous for our climate and environment. So I would love to see this happen in a way that doesn't just perpetuate that pattern of development, but that changes it for the better.
I don't know if this project will hit on that to the extent you'd like it to, because we're really focusing on infill development in your lower density single family zones. What you're talking about is, maximizing the growth that can take place in those nodes that are closer to transit along your roads. I mean, we won't be covering that as part of this project of, what would the market bear in terms of heights and densities and things like that. So you might get a little bit, but it's not going to probably touch on everything.
But with regard to the, excuse me, I completely understand what you just said, but with regard to those numbers, the PSRC numbers and all that stuff, which do matter with this, we can make an impact on those numbers with our higher density areas that we've already established. Correct? which
Yeah,
is a
and
different,
that's-
it's a sort of a different issue altogether.
No, I mean, it's part of the equation of your growth target and your housing target. The timing of this legislation didn't time up really well with the comprehensive plan update. At the next update, when you get your housing target, you're probably gonna do like a land capacity analysis of your neighborhoods and then figure out how much of you might expect of redevelopment. This is so new, but it is a part of the housing, your growth target process for sure.
Will they do one for tree redevelopment? Just kidding. Go ahead, Commissioner Olson.
I think one piece I want to touch on is, I agree with Commissioner Banasinski about trying to shift the direction we're going, and I think it does apply. I think in many ways it actually applies more to much of the more suburban sprawling areas around Kenmore than the downtown. I also have a concern with, I believe you meant to say mid-rise as opposed to like a high-rise, but I don't necessarily love putting all of our density in one spot. I like having density. I like having it in a particular area. I don't think every place should be high densities. But I also think that we should have transition from those higher densities to lower densities. And I know we already kind of have policies in place for that. That's been considered as far as, adjusting down. I've read a little bit about that. The changes that I would be interested in, though, are trying to allow for infill development to be feasible while meeting some of the things that we already want to see. Maybe not all of us, maybe I shouldn't say that, maybe I'm speaking for myself here really. But some of the things that I know we've discussed that we would like to see to make some of those more suburban areas more livable and nicer places to live. Let's say you want to take your golf cart to St. Ed's, for instance, having additional connections as an incentive when you're redeveloping missing middle and saying, if you have a through connection here that is accessible in public, right? That's a positive thing for the rest of the community that can be done as a part of these programs because we're willing to change the unit type. I would also say that as far as densities go, there's 24,000 people. I don't know the exact numbers, so I'm spitballing here, but 15,000 people of those, 15,000 people in Kenmore live in areas that are not kind of the higher density apartment buildings. And we improve the utilization of existing land area by, let's say you have a group of parents and they're retired and their kids have grown up and their kids aren't living with them and they live in a single family home. If it makes sense for them to, add another unit on that lot and split their home. So now there's 3 units on a lot where there was 1, you could have a new family living in this and they only need half the space they might have needed before. It gives them that option, that choice. And so even though we haven't necessarily dramatically increased density, we've better utilized the space we have today. And that's, I think, kind of another piece to it. That being said, these are not, affordable housing fixes or anything along those lines. This is more just, to me, it's more about making it flexible enough that we can see development move in a direction that is good for the community as a whole. Anyways.
I feel like I've gotten some good direction tonight and you can kind of see just from the conversations, this is going to be a challenge, but we're up for it. So I think based upon this, we'll bring you, we go through the comprehensive plan, we'll bring some policies that you can consider, talk about how that may relate to regulations. Just a little bit on we've got, continue to do some outreach this summer, but we're really focused on, October, November, December, your hearings. So we can back up to, July and August being some additional times to connect on codes and policies. So we're going to be working over the next week to get Todd just kind of like a framework of the code, but it's really going to be like this outline and then start framing up some of the policies and then we're going to be developing. So I think the next time that you'll see us will probably be a little further along with, you can probably see some draft policy language. And then as we continue to have that conversation. It'll help me kind of put together the code, but I have a framework. I mean, there's some things we have to do. We already know. It's really going to be like, how far do we go to kind of design this? So we'll be back with you this summer.
Thank you very much. So is there anything else from the staff that you'd like to ordain upon us tonight?
No, I appreciate this discussion. You can see that it's a complex issue. And just as a reminder that this is only one small piece. This is not going to solve all the problems. I look at this as being more about housing choice. And so that when people want to rebuild or develop or something, it's a choice. And that typically, by virtue of this type of housing being smaller, it is smaller footprint, it is generally more affordable than a typical single family home at that level. So the issues that you're struggling with tonight are typical issues that you struggle with for any policy issue when there are choices to be made. I think what we really want to bring back to you is a code which makes this kind of choice feasible and practical. And there will have to be some trade-offs made there. We've heard your concerns about the environment. We've heard your concerns about critical areas and density and parking and infrastructure. But I don't want you to kind of get so bogged down that we don't do anything. We have to do something. And I guess I just want to say is that the next time we bring it back, we will certainly try and highlight where those trade-offs can be and maybe even give a recommendation based on some of the things that you've heard. But it's not going to be perfect. It isn't. But I think we have to, we do have to recognize we have to do something. And I would say that we cannot sort of say, well, we can meet our housing requirements just by shoving everything into high density areas. Because again, I think that does not answer some of the other things that we have to address to make the community livable. So I'll be quiet now, but I just kind of want to, it's been a very interesting conversation. And I think that what we're trying to wrangle with now is how to bring it back to something. Wrap your arms around it more, because it's hard to do that in a void, and you kind of outline some of the issues that we're struggling with. So our job now is to bring you something back to react to, give more direction on. And again, that's how we're kind of slowly going to get through.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, go.
No, you.
I was just going to say, we're going to take a brief pause on the middle housing so Clay has a chance to kind of take into consideration all your great feedback and come with some framework for Debbie and myself, and then we'll revisit middle housing. We've got multiple opportunities through the rest of the summer. Next meeting, we'll revisit the natural environment element, and we'll also be bringing Richard Sawyer, who will be talking a little bit about the surface water and capital facilities element tie-in. So those three will be coming back to you at the next meeting in June. So
on behalf of the commission, we'd like to thank Clay for coming and your expertise and your excellent way of thinning this out for us so that we can try to put it into perspective of what we need to do and our alternatives of how to look at it. And certainly we look forward to working with you for a long time.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to seeing you at future meetings.
Thank you.
Dorian?
Just a good of the order thing, actually. So I don't know if we're finishing. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, item is good for the good of the order.
Just checking because I just saw it in the agenda. So the next meeting is next Tuesday. Is that correct? Oh, okay.
I was wrong on the agenda. I'm so sorry.
That's
So
all right.
I updated it. It is the 18th. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Anything else for the good of the order? Hearing none, it is 9:16 and the meeting is adjourned.